Developing news in Hampton. The state is helping to fund the development of a multi-million-dollar hotel project at Peninsula Town Center.
The goal is to boost tourism in the area. 13 News Now reporter Jacqueline Lee is live in Hampton to explain why the state is stepping in.
Regina, the state saw that the city of Hampton needs help. Hampton needs help bringing in more business and keeping revenue here. So this future hotel is seen as part of the solution. Hampton Mayor Donnie Tuck has some challenges.
Several years ago, we were told that we didn't have sufficient convention quality hotel rooms to try and track some of the larger conventions.
Without those quality hotel rooms, visitors can come to Hampton, like the convention center, but often don't stay.
They can get people here for their conferences, for their tournaments, but they can't necessarily recommend that people stay in Hampton. That is the impact of being mayor in a city that does not have quality hotels.
Meaning all that potential money is going to other cities. So today, the state announced it's stepping in to find a solution. Rita McClenny is president and CEO of Virginia Tourism.
We saw a real need, but we also saw real opportunity.
As part of the Tourism Development Finance Program, the state, in addition to the city and the hotel developer, will fund the $17 million development of the Element Hotel in Peninsula Town Center.
So it really is a nice, convenient place that has a lot of infrastructure and natural assets that visitors will use while they're on vacation.
It's one of 3 hotel projects the city currently has in its pipeline, and Mayor Tuck is excited.
Less investment by the city, which bottom line is less dollars by our taxpayers. And ultimately, they are paying state taxes, so to get some of that money coming back to Hampton is a win-win for us.
The hotel is expected to generate an additional $2 million in revenue for the city. Construction is expected to finish this fall, and once the hotel opens, 22 full-time jobs will be coming to the city. Live in Hampton, Jacqueline Lee, 13 News Now.